The shy girl painted in darkness so no one would see, but each brushstroke was quietly watched by a mysterious millionaire night after night. When the world finally uncovered her gift, she was forced to choose: stay hidden in the shadows, or step into the light and risk losing everything. Because some people aren't born to be seen. They're born to touch the things no one dares to speak aloud. What will she choose? Come with us and listen to the story of her journey. When the city began to hum itself to sleep under the hush of amber streetlights, when car horns grew sparse and window after window flicked into darkness, only then did Yumi begin to prepare to leave her room. She left no note, gave no warning. No one would know. She gathered her worn paint tubes, brushes whittled down nearly to the stem, a dark-stained handkerchief, and a notebook with a spine long since unbound. Everything went into a charcoal-grey tote bag, the kind people wouldn't bother picking up if found on the street. Her roommate was already asleep, a thin blanket pulled over her head, breathing slow beneath the steady whir of the fan. Yumi moved like a shadow, careful not to let the room make a sound, as if the air itself were made of glass. Outside the dormitory, the early November air brushed cold against her neck, and she tugged her collar tighter. She carried no phone, wore no watch, yet somehow she always arrived at the same time, 11:03 p.m. The alley she sought lay behind an old print shop shuttered for over 4 years. No one gave the back wall a second glance, just a patchwork of bricks streaked with grime and moss, flaking in uneven layers like old scars never healed. But to Yumi, it was a blank space, a silence in her soul that begged to be filled. She set her bag down, tied her hair back, and opened the first tube of paint. The acrid scent of acrylic rose thick in the air, but it didn't bother her. To her, it was the smell of another world, one where she could breathe without needing to be understood. Tonight, she painted a face. A woman's face, long, eyes, delicate lashes, and a half-formed smile. But the eyes did not smile. They looked far away at someone no longer there. Each brushstroke was a breath exhaled. She painted quickly, without pause, not from fear of being caught, but from fear the feeling might fade before it could be kept. A cat cried out somewhere in the distance. A heavy truck passed down the road, but between her and the wall there was only stillness. When the portrait neared completion, Yumi stepped back a few paces. She studied it in full, then dragged a fingertip down from one eye, a single tear trailing down. She left a mark like that every night, a crack, a flaw that kept the painting from ever being called beautiful. Because in her world, beauty had to be broken, imperfect, but true. When the church bell nearby struck once for midnight, Yumi packed up. She never stayed past 12. Not out of fear, but because she believed if she crossed that line, the art would no longer belong to her. Back in her room, she didn't turn on the lights. The soft glow of the computer screen in sleep mode was enough. She sat on the floor, opened her notebook. The last page held a faint sketch of a face still unfinished, wide eyes, distant, as if looking into some other realm. She added a single line, then stopped. From the other bed, her roommate's voice came, muffled with sleep. "You're still going to that place, Ma? Someone said there's a camera there." Yumi didn't answer right away. She only nodded, then murmured like, "Wind brushing past. If the camera's blurry, it can't really see anyone." Not far from that alley, in a darkened room on the 3rd floor of the building opposite, a man sat by the window, binoculars resting in his hand. He wasn't young, but not yet old. His face lay in shadow, but his gaze lingered on the wall. Yumi had just left. On the table before him lay a notebook, within it a perfect replica of the painting she'd just made. Not a photograph, a hand-drawn copy, down to the tilted tear. He scribbled a note in the margin. "These eyes, I drew them 10 years ago." Beside it, an old photograph, a group shot from a freshman art class, a small girl in a baseball cap sat in the far left corner, farthest from the center, but her gaze even then mirrored the one from tonight's wall. In the alley, the shadows deepened, and a faint blue light began to blink above the wall. A hidden mini-camera had been recording for who knows how long, but clearly someone had been watching, every movement, every brushstroke, every flickering smile. And as Yumi disappeared down the street, the figure behind the camera stayed still. His fingers rested lightly against the wall, right where the tear had been. He didn't wipe it away and didn't draw anything over it, and he simply stood there and remembered. The next morning, the city woke beneath a veil of pale mist, as if someone had draped a white gauze over everything. The world was quieter than usual. The sky, the streets, even people's thoughts. In that hush, Yumi walked slowly, her sneakers worn at the heel, the hem of her coat brushing gently against her leg with every step. Last night she hadn't painted. No strokes, no shapes, no color. She had simply sat for a long time before the wall that once held her. Every secret, now wiped clean. No explanation, just a single line. You paint with your soul. The words pressed against her eyelids every time she blinked. Not fear, not anger. Just that strange ache of being touched in a place she thought she'd locked away forever. In class that morning, she sat still while the lecturer's voice drifted like wind through the room. A shaft of sunlight fell across her notebook, but her mind was elsewhere. A classmate leaned over and asked quietly, "You okay? Oh, you look like you got lost somewhere." Yumi didn't answer. She didn't need to. What she felt couldn't be wrapped in the neatness of polite words. At lunch, she stopped by the usual cafe, ordered a glass of water. When the barista asked again, she simply smiled. Yeah, just water. By the window, she watched people pass, each stride, each fleeting expression, each hurried life. She wondered, had anyone ever stopped in front of that wall? Had anyone truly seen? The words returned. You paint with your soul. Not praise, not judgment, just a quiet acknowledgement from someone watching, yet unseen. That afternoon, she returned to the old alley, her old refuge. The morning rain had left puddles smeared across the concrete. The wall was bare now, more hollow than ever. Yumi didn't open her bag, didn't move. She just stood and stared. Somehow, the emptiness hit harder than any image could, because here she had lived. Truly, clearly, she sat down, leaned against the opposite wall. In that moment, she wished she could shrink, become the little girl who once doodled on walls without fearing scoldings. Back then, drawing was instinct, not purpose, not legacy. Now, it was different. Someone had seen, had wiped it clean, had left behind a sentence that made her question everything she thought she'd buried. That night, she dreamt the wall turned into a door. Behind it, a blinding white space. At the center stood the woman from her painting. Same. Eyes same half smile, same crooked tear. But this time she looked straight at Yumi and said, "Don't stop." Yumi jolted awake. In the soft yellow of the nightlight, she opened her notebook and began sketching. A faint figure behind glass, face unclear, but achingly familiar. The next morning, when she opened her door, something fell at her feet. A small folded note, no name. She unfolded it. Just one line, "I'll keep watching, not to judge." Just to remember. The words echoed like a soundless chord vibrating inside her. A comfort or a warning, and she couldn't tell. But somehow, it made her want to paint again. Not for anyone. Not to be seen. Just to once more live, fully through every stroke of the brush. If it were you, how would it feel to have the whole world see the pain you once tried to hide? Leave one word to describe how you feel right now. For 3 days, Yumi read and reread the note. She didn't carry it with her, didn't tuck it into her sketchbook. It stayed by the window, flipped and fluttered by the wind, as if even the paper couldn't decide whether to hold on or let. Koitoone. The message was short, almost cruel in its clarity. No name, no hint, and that made it linger longer in her mind than anything else. "I'll keep watching. Not to judge, just to remember." That night the wind carried both damp and dust. No rain, yet the air was wet. Not cold, yet the skin felt tight, like after a quiet touch. She returned to the wall for the first time in 4 nights. Her steps were slow, heavy, as though she was walking back into a memory not quite ready to be reborn. The alley looked the same. No one had fixed it, no one had destroyed it, no one cared. But for Yumi, the silence had changed. It was no longer a shield. It had become a mirror reflecting her tangled longing to remain hidden and her fragile wish for someone, just one person, to truly see. She opened her bag. For the first time in days, the paint tubes had dried. At the tips, the brushes stiff from neglect. Still, she tried. Her hands trembled as she twisted open the caps, but she painted no outlines, no sketches, just a face, ambiguous, genderless, with eyes that seemed to know something and were too afraid to speak it. She didn't add color, didn't sharpen the edges, didn't brighten the light, only blurred layers, smeared like stifled emotion. She painted like someone who might never paint again. When she finally set her last brush on the concrete and stepped back, her hands were aching with fatigue. Before her was an unfinished portrait, raw, almost painful in its honesty. Those eyes again looked toward someone who wouldn't come. She sat there a long while. No more painting, no more thinking, not even sure what she was waiting for. Then, without a sound, she packed up and walked away. She didn't look back. The next morning, class began with an analysis of classical portraiture. The professor asked, "What gives a painting its soul?" A few students raised their hands. Technique, light, composition, perspective. Yumi sat still, head lowered. She didn't speak. But in her mind, the answer came clear. It's what you don't paint. That afternoon, instead of the usual cafe, she walked straight to the alley. In daylight, no hoodie, no attempt to blend in. She came with a quiet bravery distilled from too many sleepless nights. But when she turned the corner, her steps halted. It was gone. All of it. Not a trace of color, not a single brush stroke. No eyes watching. Nothing remained. The wall had returned to its former self, a blank, gray, indifferent surface. Yumi stood there for a long time. Her arms hung limp. The fabric bag slipped from her shoulder and fell to the ground. She didn't bend to pick it up. Maybe she should cry, maybe she should scream, but she did neither. She just stood there as though her body had forgotten how to respond to being hurt. Images flickered through her mind. The trembling, nights with brush in hand, a cat's cry cutting through the dark, the dim flicker of the streetlight, the words, "You paint with your soul." And finally, the eyes she painted just the night before. Nothing lasts. No painting. No pain. But no trust either is strong enough to endure when every trace has been erased. Yumi walked away, not back to the dorm, but to somewhere. Hell, somewhere inside her no one had yet reached. In her room, she opened her bag, not to take anything out, but to empty it completely. Each tube of paint, each brush, her sketchbook. One by one, she tossed them into the trash like peeling off layers of herself. Not slowly, not sentimentally, just necessarily. The handkerchief, the one she always used to wipe. Paint, wipe hands, wipe the tears that sometimes slipped out. That she kept, folded it neatly, slipped it into a drawer, slammed it shut. No one can destroy an artist's passion, but some nights, it's the artist who does it themselves, to survive the weight of believing again. That night, she didn't leave. Her room, didn't turn on the lights, didn't open her laptop. She just sat on her bed in the dark, listening to the quiet tap of the first seasonal rain on the eaves. For the first time in years, she didn't dream. There was only white space, blank, unending, and without a place to land. There was no warning, no chime, no knock on the door. Just the same silent room, the rain falling in soft, steady rhythm, as if to lull the world to sleep. Yumi thought she was still hidden, still safe. But the next morning, when she reached for her phone out of habit, everything had changed. A message popped up in the class group chat. "Yumi, is this you in the video?" Below it, more messages. Old friends, surprised, amazed, impressed. Her breath caught as she saw the YouTube link. She didn't have to click it. Her heart had already dropped. The video was under 3 minutes and shot from afar. But the light, the hair, the silhouette, the movements of the brush beneath the night sky, it was her. Undeniably her. Her. In a moment she had thought, was hers alone, just her and the wall in the quiet dark. Now broadcast to thousands of eyes. She didn't move. Beneath the video, the comments scrolled endlessly. Praise, comparisons, words of wonder. But the cruel ones, just a few, cut deepest, staged to get attention. Bet she knew she was being filmed. Midnight painting? Who's buying that? Yumi didn't cry, but her throat tightened. Her hand slipped from the phone, shut her laptop, shoved everything into a drawer like slamming the door before a storm, but the video wasn't in the drawer anymore. It had moved past her, out into a world she no longer controlled. That afternoon she didn't go to class, didn't return to the alley. She walked, nowhere in particular. Every passing face felt like judgment. Familiar streets felt foreign. Each step echoed the same quiet question. What if? What if no one had filmed her? What if the painting had been erased again? What if she'd never been seen? She caught her reflection in a public mirror. Tangled hair, shadowed eyes. But what stopped her wasn't her appearance. It was the haunting feeling that she was looking at someone else entirely. Someone who had lost the last layer keeping her safe from harm. That night, alone in her room, Yumi opened her sketchbook. The last page held a half-formed face, vague, undefined. She picked up a pen, set it down, picked it up again, 10 times. Then, in the margin, she wrote, "I don't know who I am and when everyone can see me." The next morning, when she opened her door, another folded note dropped to her feet. No name, no explanation, just a link. She clicked it. Another. Video. A continuation of that same night. After she had gone, the camera kept rolling. A man appeared in the frame. Tall, long coat, dark gloves. He didn't erase the painting, didn't take a photo. He simply stood there for a long time, then took out a notebook, scribbled a few lines and walked away. No sound. No caption. But the silence said everything. Below the clip, no likes, no comments, just a single line pinned to the top. There are some shadows we choose to follow, not to own them, but to remember who we used to be. Yumi stared. For a long while. Read it again. And again, and for the first time in days she exhaled. Long, soft, full. It wasn't an ending. Not a beginning either. But perhaps just enough for her to choose not to disappear. After days of letting everything drift by like water flowing through the veins of the city, Yumi had grown accustomed to not knowing what came next. She stopped checking social media, stopped reading messages, stopped noticing glances in classroom. Hallways. Something in her had curled inward, like a seed pressed deep beneath cold soil. Not dead, but with no reason yet to grow again. Until that morning, the letter arrived as she stood, absent-minded, in front of the dormitory mailboxes. Not expecting anything, just clinging to an old high school habit. Her fingers touched an ivory envelope with no return address. The paper was thick, faintly scented, chosen with care. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the lines, and the further she read, the more her hands began to tremble. Embossed silver. Letters, a formal invitation and a scheduled time, a renowned gallery, all spelled out with precision, and at the very bottom, the words that made her heart falter. To the artist whose soul speaks through silence, your exhibition is ready, funded, curated, and loved anonymously, no name, no signature, only that final sentence, like a fingertip brushing against the quietest place inside her. She sat down on a stone bench near the dorm gates, still clutching the letter, like it might vanish if she let go. Her heart was a landscape of contradictions, half lit with hope, half dimmed by disbelief, and it was all too much and too beautiful, too sudden, too unlike anything she'd ever let herself believe she deserved. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know who to ask for reassurance, didn't even know if anyone had ever truly seen her as an artist rather than just the girl who paints in secret at night. The letter required no reply, offered no instructions, yet it stated one thing with absolute clarity. The exhibition was happening. If she chose to show up, That afternoon, she made her way to the gallery, mentioned in the letter, just to look. She didn't go inside. From across the street, she watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows where white light bathed every frame within. The space was so quiet, so clean, it felt like another world. A world where art was named, priced, seen, preserved. She couldn't picture her paintings there. Not because she was afraid, but because she'd never allowed herself to imagine that far. A car horn jolted her back to reality. She took a few steps back, turned away. But inside her, a question had begun to rise, clearer with each passing moment. Who? Who had seen her? Who had watched not to judge, but simply to remember? As dusk fell, she retraced her old paths, the alleys, the narrow lanes where she used to paint each night, hoping to stumble on a clue. But there was nothing. The corners were quiet again. No brush strokes, no words, no watching. Eyes. That evening she poured herself a glass of water and sat beneath the soft amber glow of her desk lamp. The letter still lay on the table, a shard of light in a grey space. She opened her sketchbook, turned through abandoned pages, rough outlines she had once meant to finish, now trembling with the residue of old, uncertain days. The tremble wasn't in the lines, it was in the fear that maybe she'd never had permission to be seen. In the middle of a blank page, she wrote, "If this is a dream, then at least it's the dream I once forgot I had." Close to midnight, she opened her laptop for the first time in weeks. The internet was slow. Her hands typed cautiously. But for the first time, she searched the name of the gallery and froze. It was real, verified, detailed, elegantly presented. On the gallery's official site, the exhibition calendar had been updated. Solo exhibition, untitled works, anonymous artist, opening next week. Below the banner, a single image, not a face, just a figure, a girl with her head. Jayatuld, brush in hand, standing before a wall beneath the soft blur of a street lamp. Yumi recognized her own posture, not a stolen shot. It was a photo someone had held onto. For maybe a very long time she stared at the screen. There was no anger, no panic, only a new breath. Deeper, calmer, as if, after all these years, she was finally stepping into the space she'd only ever watched from a distance. Some truths don't arrive with a sound. They don't burst into the room with drama or fanfare. They slip quietly through the cracks of intuition, impossible to name, yet impossible not to feel. Yumi had lived in that state for 3 days since learning of the exhibition. In her chest, the phrase "anonymous patron" began sketching out its own imagined identities. A reclusive collector, a former professor who'd seen the video, maybe even a stranger passing by. But one image clung to her thoughts, blurred, distant, yet sharpening with time. A pair of eyes that had once watched her through the stillness of a first-year art class, where she always sat in the back, face hidden in a sketch pad. Ren, a name that hadn't surfaced in years. They had never spoken, only shared a few courses. He had always been quiet, withdrawn, not arrogant, just unreachable. Once she'd seen him sketching the hand of a homeless man in a cafe. The lines he drew stayed with her, not because they were beautiful, but because they seemed drawn from memory, from something unfinished inside him. She searched his name online, and this time, it didn't take much. Ren was now a startup, investor in creative technology, rarely in the media but known enough to be found. His photo on a magazine profile, head turned, eyes looking away, made her breath catch. There was something in that gaze, familiar, unsettling. That afternoon, Yumi received a call from the gallery. A woman's voice, calm and precise. "Hello, Ms. Yumi. We'd like to invite you to review the gallery layout. And the patron will be there if you're willing to meet." Willing. That word repeated in her mind like an echo. She wasn't sure what she was willing for, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. The gallery, in the soft hush of late afternoon, felt like a library. The walls held test prints from the video, frames frozen mid-brushstroke, Scans from her old sketchbook, the one she'd thrown away and someone had recovered. Even the originals, pieces she thought were lost, now preserved behind glass like artifacts of a language never spoken aloud. And then he stepped in. No introduction, no warning. Ren stood across the room, tall, coat draped over his frame, gaze unchanged. Maybe quieter now, maybe softer. But still the same gaze that had once passed through space, not to observe her, but to hold something of her in silence. Yumi didn't speak. She only looked. Ren didn't rush. He walked to one painting, the one she'd made in the rain. Thinking no one was watching, he said nothing of brushwork, nothing of technique. He just asked gently, as if the words had been waiting years, "You still paint the same way?" She nodded, then silence until she whispered, almost incomplete, "Why?" Ren met her eyes for the first time. "Because I once wished I had the courage you did, but I didn't. I couldn't paint what I really felt. And you painted everything. Even when no one was watching." She didn't know whether to thank him, accuse him, or run. She only asked, "Why me?" He was quiet a moment. "Because I saw you once, sketching by the dorm's back wall, when no one else looked. I saw your work in first year and I never forgot it." She bit her lip, her chest tight, not knowing if what she felt was gratitude or fear. "And this exhibition, is it meant to save me?" Ren shook his head. "No. I just wanted you to know. Real talent doesn't need to wait for permission, but if someone can help it breathe, don't turn away." That night she returned to her room with a contract for the exhibition. Just one signature left, hers. She sat at her desk staring at the page as though it were asking something much larger than a name. If she signed, everything would change. Her work would be seen, her name tied to images that once belonged only to her. But if she didn't, would she have the strength to go on with only loneliness as her companion? She picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, but eventually the first stroke of ink met the paper. No applause, no triumph, just a quiet acceptance that sometimes being truly seen isn't a threat but a beginning, a chance to be born again. She signed, not with celebration, not out of a thirst for recognition, but because something quiet had shifted inside her, like an underground spring breaking free after years of silent pressure. After meeting Ren, Yumi spent night after night in the old storage room of the dormitory, once forgotten, now transformed into her studio. It became the space where she finished her final pieces, not for anyone else, not to impress, but simply to tell the stories she still owed herself. She didn't choose the polished ones, not the pieces that had gone viral in that video. She chose old sketches, raw strokes, eyes without names, is without. Together they became something honest, not perfect, but enough for someone to look and maybe see themselves. And then the night came. The gallery glowed under soft golden light, not crowded, but full. The people who came moved with a quiet reverence. No loud chatter, no flashing selfies, no careless commentary. They walked slowly, pausing at each frame as if listening for something that had never been said aloud. Yumi stood at the edge. Not at the center, no introduction, no speech. She simply watched, and for the first time in her life saw her work truly live. Not needing to scream, not needing to be explained. It simply existed and reached the ones it was meant. For her, at one point, a middle-aged woman broke into tears before a drawing of a little girl with hair covering most of her face. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't step back. She stood there, holding the hand of someone beside her. And from across the room, Yumi felt her heart stir. Just a flicker, but enough to remind her. Art sometimes needs no explanation to become essential. Ren didn't come. Yumi wasn't surprised. She wasn't disappointed. Though for a brief moment, she looked toward the door every time it creaked open. But she understood. Presence isn't always in arrival. Sometimes it's in what was planted long before. So she had prepared a single frame, placed at the far end of the hallway where few would look. The painting had no signature, no title, Just the figure of a person standing behind a fogged pane of glass, one hand resting against a damp wall. The face was blurred, but the light in the frame fell precisely across the heart. Beneath the glass, a small, handwritten note. Some people never speak, but they say everything by simply watching. She didn't know if Ren would ever see it, but she knew. It was a gift she needed to give. Not to be answered, but to close something that had been open. For far too long the night ended, people drifted out and the lights dimmed. The gallery returned to its original hush. Yumi was the last to remain. She stood before the very first piece she had ever drawn, now framed in the center of the room. A pair of eyes gazing into the distance. The same eyes, the same quiet. Elk, but this time they were not alone. She reached out, fingertips grazing the frame, not to check it but to offer a final touch. A soft farewell to the version of herself who had once created in the dark. And then she smiled. Softly. Very softly. Not because everything was suddenly right, but because at last she had allowed herself to be seen. The morning after the exhibition, the city woke as it always did. Unmoved, unchanged, at least to the passers-by. But for Yumi, something had shifted. Not loud, not visible. Just a soft loosening in her chest. A breath of quiet space, opening within the tangle of feelings she'd kept pressed down for so long. She hadn't dreamed that night. And that morning she didn't drink coffee, didn't check her email, didn't turn on her phone. She simply pulled on her beige canvas coat, slipped a few paint tubes and brushes into her familiar fabric bag, and walked out of the dormitory. Like someone who finally knew where they were going. For the first time in a long while, Yumi returned to that narrow alley, the one where she used to paint in the dark, breathe between peeling bricks and flickering yellow street lamps once, believing herself completely unseen. But this time she didn't come to hide. She came to step forward. The sun had just risen. A soft band of light filtered between the high-rise buildings. Early morning motorbikes, hurried workers, the call of vendors selling bread, all of it forming a gentle city hum, alive but not overwhelming. She walked into the alley without lowering her head, without shielding her face. For the first time, she let the sunlight touch the hand that held her brush. The wall had aged, more cracks in the bricks, faint traces of what she'd once painted, dreams washed away by rain, wiped clean by passers-by. But today she wasn't here to reclaim the past. She was here to offer something, one final piece, not to keep, to give. And so she began to paint. No sketch, no plan, just brushstrokes flowing from the center of her palm through to her fingertips, as if her body had been holding this image in silence for years. A little girl, knees drawn to her chest beneath a broken awning. Over her, a narrow beam of sunlight slipped through a gap in the bricks, and beside her a shadow, formless, barely there, but leaning in her direction, not to shield perhaps, but simply to be near. Each stroke was a breath, unrushed, unrevised, undoubted. An older man passing by stopped to watch. A little girl holding her mother's hand stood still, eyes wide. A delivery driver slowed his scooter. No one spoke. No one interrupted. But they all looked, and when the painting was finished, Yumi reached into her bag and took out a tube of white paint, unscrewing the cap slowly, as if this were the most deliberate act of the day. She wrote one line beneath the girl's feet, not bold, not large, but directly where the eye would land. Even shadows can feel the sun, and she didn't sign it. She stepped back, stood in silence, no applause, no compliments, but no one left. As if the image and that single line had whispered something they had all at one time or another, longed to hear, but never found the words to say. A tiny girl, no older than 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked, "Mum, is that lady a real artist?" Yumi turned, smiled. Not the smile of someone discovered, not the shy smile of someone who once ran from being seen, but the quiet smile of someone who had finally set something heavy down and stood up, lighter, deeper. She left the alley just before noon. The sun was high now, sharp against the pavement, but her chest felt unburdened. She no longer needed that wall to hide behind, and she no longer needed anyone to fully understand her. Because in the end, art isn't meant to prove anything. It exists so that someone, even just one person, might see themselves in it and keep going. If you've ever done something you love quietly, unseen, remember this: real value doesn't all come from the spotlight, but from what touches the heart of another. And if this story moved you, like and subscribe to keep walking with me through the beautiful human stories still waiting to be told.